I built my first house with my own hands when I was 26 years old. Not a big house, 3 bedrooms, a single-car garage, and a porch that tilted slightly to the left, because I didn't yet know what I didn't know. My father drove up from Barrie on a Saturday morning, looked at that porch, and said nothing. He just walked to the truck, pulled out his level, and handed it to me. That was his way. He never told me I was wrong. He just gave me the tools to figure it out myself. By the time I turned 40, I had grown that single house into a mid-sized residential construction company based out of Guelph, Ontario. We built homes across Wellington County, took on commercial projects in Hamilton, expanded slowly and carefully through the 90s when everyone else was over-leveraging. By the time the housing market went sideways in 2008, we were debt-free. While my competitors were filing for creditor protection, I was quietly buying equipment at auction. My accountant called me lucky. My father, if he had still been alive, would have called it patience. I never remarried after my wife passed. My son was 17 when we lost her. I raised him alone through those years, the teenage years that try every parent, the university years that cost a fortune, and then finally the years where he came back and worked beside me. He started at the bottom the way I had. He ran crews, dealt with suppliers, managed subcontract. I watched him grow into the role. I was proud of him. I want you to understand that clearly, because everything I'm about to tell you cannot be understood without first knowing how proud I was. The retirement party was my idea. I was 64, and I had spent 40 years in construction. My knees told me every morning that I was not 26 anymore. I had saved well, invested wisely, and owned the company outright. The plan was simple. Over the next 12 months, I would gradually transfer ownership and operational control to my son. The party was the announcement, a dinner at the Cotton Club in Guelph, with 60 people from our industry, our family, and 35 years of relationships I had built, one handshake at a time. I had rented a large cottage on a lake in Muskoka for the long weekend before the party. Family and close friends. My son was there with his wife, my daughter-in-law, whom I had come to care for as my own. My sister and her husband drove up from London. A few old friends from the early days. We had been there since Friday, and it was now Sunday night, the evening before we would all drive back to Guelph for Monday's dinner. I have always been an early riser. 3 in the morning, I woke up the way I often do, just awake. No alarm, no reason. I put on my robe and walked down the hall to make tea. The cottage was one of those older Muskoka properties, the kind built in the 70s with walls that were honest about their limitations. Sound traveled easily. My son's room was at the end of the hallway. His door was not fully latched. I was not trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I had no reason to. I was walking past his door in socks on a hardwood floor at 3 in the morning, thinking about nothing except whether we had Earl Grey or only English breakfast. And then I heard my name. I stopped. "He has no idea," my son was saying. His voice was low, but not low enough. "He thinks I've been waiting patiently all these years out of love. 60 parties and handshakes, and I still have to smile and pretend I respect that man's decisions. Once the papers are signed, that's it. I don't owe him anything after that. He can retire to his rocking chair and stay out of my way." There was a pause. He was on the phone. No, I'm not worried. He trusts me completely. That's always been his weakness. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time, long enough that the cold from the hardwood floor came up through my socks, long enough to hear my son laugh at something the other person said, a laugh I recognized but had never heard in quite that register before. I went and made my tea. I sat in the kitchen looking at the lake in the dark, and I did not cry. I had not cried since my wife's funeral. I thought about my father and his level. I thought about 40 years of early mornings. I thought about what I actually knew about my son versus what I had chosen to believe. And by the time the sun started coming up over the water, I had made a decision. I would not say a word. Not that morning, not at the party, not the following week. I would smile, I would give the speech I had prepared, and then I would do what every good builder knows you must do before you walk away from a structure. I would inspect it properly. I would find out, once and for all, whether what I had built in my son was solid, or whether it was, like that very first porch, tilted in ways I had been too proud to measure. The party was lovely. My son stood beside me at the podium and spoke about the company, about what my mentorship had meant to him, about the future he was committed to building. He was convincing. I had always known he was convincing. I clapped with everyone else. The following Monday, I met with my lawyer and my accountant. I did not tell them what I had heard. I told them I wanted to restructure the transition timeline. Instead of a 12-month handover, I wanted a performance-based framework, 4 milestones over 18 months, each one releasing a specific percentage of equity, each one tied to measurable outcomes, client retention above 90%, gross margin maintained within 5 points of our 3-year average, no new debt without my written approval, employee turnover no higher than it had been in any of the last 5 years. My lawyer asked if something had changed. I told him I had simply decided to be more rigorous. He was satisfied with that. When I sat down with my son and explained the new structure, he smiled, the same smile I had watched him practice for years. He said he understood completely. He said the milestones were fair. He shook my hand. His grip was firm. What happened over the following 6 months was not something I engineered. I want to be very precise about this, because the distinction matters to me. I did not sabotage him. I did not create obstacles. I stepped back almost entirely from the operations of the company, the way I had promised, and I let my son run things the way he had claimed he was ready to do. The first problem emerged in October, 3 months in. We had a long-standing relationship with a developer out of Cambridge, a man I had known since 1997, who had given us contracts worth close to $8 million over the years. He called me on my cell, which he rarely did, and told me he had decided not to renew his preferred vendor agreement with us for the coming year. His tone was careful and polite, but I had known him long enough to hear what he was not saying. I thanked him, told him I understood, and said I hoped we would work together again someday. I did not call my son about it. I waited. It took my son 11 days to tell me. He framed it as a mutual decision. He said the developer had been difficult to work with, and that we were better off pursuing other relationships. He said it with complete confidence. I nodded. I said almost nothing. But I had already spoken to 3 of our site supervisors separately, the way I used to do my quiet Friday walkarounds. What I learned was that my son had showed up to a site meeting with that developer's project manager 40 minutes late, without an explanation or an apology, had challenged the man's specifications in front of the full crew in a manner that was described to me as unnecessary, and had then not returned 2 follow-up calls for a week. The developer had not ended the relationship because he was difficult. The developer had ended the relationship because my son had made him feel like an inconvenience. I thought about that first porch. I thought about what my father knew, and chose not to say. November was quieter. My son stabilized some accounts and closed a new contract with a subdivision developer in Elora, which I acknowledged genuinely it was good work, and I told him so. I was not trying to be cruel. I was trying to be honest with myself about what I was seeing. There were real capabilities in my son. That was never the question. The question was about character. And character, as my father used to say, is not what a man does when he knows you're watching. The second milestone came due in January. Gross margin had slipped 7 points below our average. He missed the threshold. He came to me with a detailed explanation involving material cost increases, a wet fall that had delayed 2 projects, and a subcontractor dispute that had cost us time. Some of these factors were real. The wet fall was real. The material costs were real. But when I pulled the project files myself quietly, without telling him I was doing it, I found 3 change orders that had been approved without the client sign-off our standard contracts required. We had absorbed costs that should have been billed. It was not fraud. It was sloppiness. The kind of sloppiness that comes from someone who believes the rules are for other people. I released the first tranche of equity anyway, 30%. My accountant raised an eyebrow when I told him. I said the milestones were meant to measure trajectory, not perfection. What I did not tell my accountant was what I had done the week before. I had quietly restructured my personal estate. My son's portion of the inheritance, the financial inheritance beyond the business, was now split differently. A significant portion had been redirected into a charitable foundation I had established in my wife's name, managed by a board that I controlled and that my son had no role in. This was not punishment. This was protection for the employees of the company, for the clients who depended on us, for the 31 people who had worked for me for more than a decade, and who had families of their own. My son did not know this yet. February brought the moment I had been waiting for, though not in the way I expected. I was at the shop. I still kept an office there, though I rarely used it when one of our longest-serving project managers knocked on my door. He had been with me for 19 years. He sat across from my desk and told me he was considering an offer from another company. He said it carefully, respectfully, the way a loyal employee tells you something hard. He said the culture had shifted. He said he felt that the way crews were being spoken to had changed. He named 2 other senior staff who were, in his words, quietly looking. I asked him what he needed to stay. He said he needed to know that the things that had made this company what it was were still there. I told him they were. I told him to give me 60 days. That evening, I called my son and asked him to meet me for breakfast the following morning at a diner on Stone Road that we had been going to together since he was 14 years old. He arrived before me, which he almost never did. He had coffee waiting. I sat down, and for a long moment, I just looked at my son, this man who had my wife's eyes and my father's stubbornness, and I felt something that I can only describe as grief and love existing in exactly the same space at exactly the same time. I told him what the project manager had told me. I told him about the other 2 staff members. I did not soften it. I put it on the table between us the way my father had put that level in my hands. My son's first reaction was defensiveness. He said the project manager had always been resistant to change. He said the other staff were probably exaggerating. He started to explain the business reasons for the operational adjustments he had made. I let him finish. Then I asked him a question I had been carrying since that Sunday night in Muskoka. I said, "Do you think I built this company because I was good at construction?" He looked at me. I said, "I built it because I treated every person who worked for me like their time mattered. I treated every client like their house was the most important project we had ever taken on. I made decisions like I was going to have to look those people in the eye for the next 30 years. Because I was. That's not a style of management. That is the entire structure. Remove it, and everything else falls." My son was quiet for a while. He looked at his coffee. Then he said, "I know." He said it in a way that was different from his usual tone. Smaller. More like the kid who used to sit across from me in that same diner after hockey practice, tired and honest. I did not say anything about that night in Muskoka. I did not tell him I had heard him. I am still not entirely sure why. Perhaps because I had decided, somewhere in those months, that what I was watching was not evidence of who my son truly was. It was evidence of who he had been allowed to become in the absence of real accountability. Those are not the same thing. I had played a part in that. A father who removes every obstacle from his child's path does not prepare that child for the weight of the path itself. What I told him instead was this. The remaining equity transfer was on hold. Not canceled, on hold. The milestones had been real, and 2 of them had not been met in their spirit, even where they had been met on paper. I was not angry. I was not punishing him. But I was not going to hand him something he had not yet earned. And I was not going to pretend that the last 6 months had been what they should have been. I told him the project manager was not going anywhere, because I was going to spend the next 30 days working alongside my son. Not as the owner, but as a colleague. I was going to show him what I knew, the things you cannot learn from a spreadsheet or a construction management course, the things that live in how you stand at a job site, and what you say first when something goes wrong. My son sat across from me and nodded. This time his nod was different too. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Ontario, teasing you for weeks with cold mornings before finally meaning it. I was back on sites I hadn't walked in 2 years. I had forgotten, genuinely forgotten, how much I missed it, the smell of fresh concrete, the sound of framing crews working at pace, the particular satisfaction of watching a roofline go up straight and true. My son watched me. I watched him watching me. I watched him apologize to a subcontractor for a scheduling miscommunication without being asked to. I watched him stay 2 hours later than anyone else on a Friday to make sure a foundation inspection was ready for the following Monday. I watched him have a conversation with one of our youngest crew members, a kid from Kitchener, who reminded me of myself at 23, and give that kid the kind of direct, encouraging feedback that takes real confidence to give, not flattery. Honest assessment. Here is what you did well. Here is what you need to work on. Here is why I know you can do it. I did not comment on any of it. I just kept showing up. In April, the project manager came back to my office. He sat in the same chair. He said he was withdrawing his notice. He said something had changed, that the tone on sites felt different, that he felt heard again. He said he didn't know what had happened, but that he was grateful. I told him nothing had happened. I told him this was always the company it had been. The Cambridge developer called me in May. He asked if we might have a conversation about a new mixed-use project he was developing in the West End. I told him I would pass his number to my son, who was running our operations, and that I had every confidence the call would go well. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "That's not the answer I expected from you." I told him expectations were worth examining now and then. My son took that meeting. He called me afterward and told me about it not because I asked, but because he wanted to. He said the developer had seemed cautious at first, but that they had talked for nearly 2 hours, and that he had listened more than he had spoken, and that he thought there was a real chance of rebuilding the relationship. He said he understood now why I had always valued that relationship. He said he was sorry he had been careless with it. It was the first time he had used that word with me without me asking for it. I'm not going to pretend that those months resolved everything. My son and I are not the same as we were before that Sunday night in Muskoka, but I'm not sure we should be. The relationship we have now is more honest than the one we had before. There is less performance in it on both sides. He knows that I expect real things from him. I know that he is capable of real things when he is not operating on the assumption that they will be given to him regardless. The final equity transfer documents were signed in September, 14 months after the retirement party. My lawyer prepared them on a Tuesday afternoon, and my son and I signed them at that same diner on Stone Road. No ceremony, no speeches. I ordered a grilled cheese sandwich because that is what I always order there. And my son ordered what he always orders. And we sat across from each other the way we had sat there 100 times. Before we left, my son said he wanted to say something. He looked down at the table first, the way he does when he is choosing his words carefully, instead of just reaching for the fastest ones. He said, "I wasn't ready 2 years ago. I thought I was, but I was ready to have the thing, not to do the work. I understand the difference now. I'm not sure I would have learned it if you hadn't made me." I told him I appreciated that. Then I told him there was something else he should know. I told him about the estate restructuring. I told him about the foundation, about the shift in the inheritance split, about the reasons behind it. I told him not to see it as punishment, but as the appropriate consequence of decisions that had real costs for real people. I told him the foundation was something he could earn a role in over time if he chose to, by demonstrating through his leadership of the company that the values the foundation was built to honor were values he actually held. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded once. He said, "That's fair." 2 words. But they were the right 2. I drove home on the 401 that evening, as the sun was dropping behind the fields west of Guelph. I had my window down a few inches, the way I like it in September, when the air still has warmth in it, but the edge of autumn is already there. I was thinking about my father, about that level he handed me when I was 26 and didn't know what I was doing. I was thinking about how long it had taken me to understand what he was really giving me. He was not giving me a tool. He was giving me accountability. He was saying, "You built this, and if it is not right, that is yours to fix. Not a punishment, a responsibility. The kind you carry because you are capable of carrying it, and because being capable of something and doing it are not the same thing until you choose to make them the same." I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. I thought about that Sunday morning in Muskoka, standing in the dark hallway in my robe and my socks, holding a cup of Earl Grey tea that I had not yet made, listening to my son say things that I had never expected to hear from him. I thought about what I had felt in those moments, not the anger, which had come and gone quickly, but the thing underneath it. The question I had to answer for myself before I could answer anything else. Was this a son who had always been this way, hidden from me for 30 years? Or was this a son who had grown into a shape that the people around him, including me, had made possible by never requiring anything different? I still do not know the full answer. I suspect the honest answer involves both things. But I know this. The man who signed those papers in September was not the man who had laughed on the phone in August of the year before. And the difference between those 2 men was not time. It was truth, delivered without cruelty and without apology. The truth that what you inherit is not what you deserve. It is only where you begin. My father knew that. He handed me a level and let me figure out what to do with it. I am trying, in my own imperfect way, to do the same. Don't forget to subscribe to tr-sweetrevenge for more real stories about family, trust, and the kind of love that asks something of the people it believes in. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needed to hear this today, share it with them.